Sparks that I don't remember. Hold and let it shine. Fix and start to fade away. Fix and start to fade away. Fix and start to fade away.
Hello, dear friends of Kabbalah International. We are again with our dear friend MarioSaban.
How are you, Nacho? Good morning.
Good morning, Mario. Shalom. Well, today we are going to work on the history of Kabbalah, a new episode. Before we start recording, I was mentioning that I find it important to discuss the fundamental aspect of mysticism, which is the direct connection with God without intermediaries, unlike the strictly religious aspect.
Yes, that's right. What mysticism proposes is to take up again the original relationship that we had, let's say, throughout history. When you read in the biblical text that Abraham heard the voice of God, undoubtedly Abraham had a direct relationship when Jacob is also hearing the voice of God. Moreover, we can say that he has a direct appearance with the angel, and we will speak. Moses himself has a direct relationship with the divinity, and if you see throughout history, and the prophets of Israel and all of them had a direct relationship, what the mystic wants to do is to break the intermediation to see how it becomes. Again, how to return to that direct relationship with divinity. Of course, here we have, as always, paradoxes, because we have a direct relationship with a divinity that seems external to us, and a direct relationship with the divinity that enters into the emptiness of one's soul, into one's interior.
Yes.
Because from the perspective of Kabbalah, one is like a vessel that receives divine energy into oneself. So here we have to, I believe that basically we can have two clear approaches. On one hand, we can feel that we have a dialogue with a cosmic energy that is beyond us, a cosmogonic energy, and on the other hand, we can feel an internal dialogue with those divine forces within ourselves through that emptiness, that hollowness. So there is a direct relationship, but we all feel it in different ways. Not everyone feels it the same. Some perceive it as more distant, while others feel it so close that they even experience what is called bitul, annihilation, where they feel completely imbued by that divine energy and feel they lose their subjectivity, their identity, right? So there are levels, I would say, of communication with the divinity that end up being levels of revelation of God within the integral structure where subjectivity is lost in the cosmogonic. That is why I would say that in the direct relations with the divinity, I would say that there are different souls with different frequencies of arrival, or not to the matrix. The closer you are to the matrix, the less self-identity you have, and the more distant you are from the matrix, the more self-identity you have. That self-identity is good to stay in this reality, but it can be dangerous, because if you move too far away from the matrix, you can just receive. But receive to retain in a selfish way, then being too far away from the matrix makes you become very unsupportive of others, because you think you are the only one who has to survive, isn't it? In the end, the individual identity is, I am going to defend myself from the lion. The lion should not eat me. Then if he wants to, he should eat the others. So this perception, which is an egoic perception of the subjectivity given by the physical survival in the field of matter, alters a lot the real cosmogonic relations of unity in the totality. Then we have to be careful, because in the field of matter, the forces of evil, of fragmentation and division are much greater than in the superior levels of the matter.
Regarding what you're explaining about the direct relationship with God and connecting it back to the study of Kabbalah, also linking it with the Kabbalists of Sepharad, there's an anecdote I'd like you to share. It's short, but it relates to the fact that for many years the tradition of transmitting Kabbalah was oral, and Kabbalists were generally withdrawn and hidden. I recall you mentioned the question you asked your grandfather. Not so many years ago, isn't it true? In relation to the subject of the study of the Kabbalah.
That's right. In relation to the Merkava, because when I read as a child the first chapter of Ezekiel, I don't know how old I would have been. I think it was in 79, so I would have been 13 years old, or in 77. I would have been between 11 and 13 years old. I think I was 13. After reading the first chapter of Ezekiel, I remember that I turned to my grandfather, a very traditional man, and I told him, "Look, grandfather, I conclude that those who are here in the text of Ezekiel are extraterrestrials, and that God is an anthropomorphic extraterrestrial." Well, I wasn't so far off. What I read 40 years later in the Kabbalah, then my grandfather says, yes, it is possible. He told me it is possible that they are extraterrestrials, only that when they come down, they are going to say that they also believe in God. That caught my attention because it was an argumentation that I did not expect, sincerely and very good. Because what he was telling me is that the message is superior even to the anthropomorphic God of the Torah text. Imagine to say to a 12, 13-year-old boy, it was a bit of a shock for that child. It seems that I had to study Kabbalah 40 years later to try to see.
So we know what the reason is.
I've spent my whole life studying Kabbalah to see if my grandfather's answer was real.
And candies.
Of course, my grandfather's candies, which were permanently a great... Imagine how I ended up with the lure of candy. But basically, I will tell you, that's when I realized this thing that the extraterrestrials come and say, yes, we are the God of the Merkava, but we believe in God. It caught my attention because undoubtedly, we are talking about a message. We are talking about an infinite energy, superior to the universe. In this sense, there is something very strong in this, because if you start thinking about the implications of infinity within the context of the mentality of a human being, first of all, the first conclusion is that no matter how much evil destroys, the infinite always wins, because the infinite has the possibility to build infinitely. Therefore, this dual idea of good and evil, that eternally good and evil are going to be fighting, is not real. Because finally, why do we say that good is going to win? Because we are naive, aren't we? Because good has the infinite that it wants to build next to it, and evil does not have the infinite, then the evil can destroy everything that exists in the universe and nothing else. It can't destroy the infinite. Therefore, the dualism between good and evil does not operate merely due to naivety. Good overcomes evil because it is backed by the infinite, whereas evil, being finite, is destroyed and can no longer inflict harm once it has been eradicated. On the other hand, good can continue building upon something constructed. Therefore, the logic isn't that good will defeat evil simply because it is good, but rather because good has the infinite as its ally. Here we have a sort of physical analysis through which we understand that redemption will be achieved as a process of continuous construction towards the future. And then also another key factor, that we would not be talking about humility at the moral level. It's not that I have to work on my humility. It is that the structure of the reality in which I find myself automatically makes me humble by perceiving the infinite and contemplating the infinite I can say how proud I am in front of the infinite comparatively. Therefore, in the end, another conclusion one reaches from the infinite is that all human pride is undoubtedly a product of ignorance. Because comparing yourself with infinity makes you have a structural humility. Good will win over evil, and one has to be humble not because of moral values, but because of physical understanding of the universe.
That's it. Very well, Mario. Regarding what I was asking you about the study of the Kabbalah at some... You mentioned that when you also asked your grandfather who were those who studied Kabbalah, your grandfather referred to you as well, those who are out there. But of course it was not a practice that was, let's say, very visible to the general public.
Absolutely invisible. People outside the Jewish community hold regarding Kabbalah, believing that everyone within the community is a Kabbalist because they study Kabbalah all day. However, this is not the case. The vast majority of Jews worldwide are unaware of Kabbalah even today, and its teachings have always been closely guarded by sages. That's why I often mention, as you rightly said and have repeated, the anecdote with my grandfather. When I was young, there was no information available on Kabbalah. It was considered deep knowledge reserved only for the community's rabbi and a few other sages. The community primarily followed Jewish identity and liturgy, with these deeper topics remaining obscure. It's interesting to note that in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the spiritual need in the West compelled Kabbalah to emerge. It wasn't just within the Jewish tradition, but rather a response of Judaism to an existential void in the West. This emergence of Jewish mysticism mysteriously occurred over centuries. Accumulates in a certain way in the secret, and that ends up being today the spiritual reserve of the West. That is to say, because what remained as exoteric religion in Islam, Christianity, and Judaism are basically literal repetitions of the biblical, Quranic, or New Testament stories. People stayed on the surface in the religious field when people wanted to access much deeper levels. They started to go into Christian mysticism, Sufism, and Kabbalah. What do you find in Kabbalah? A system with such a great accumulation of information that basically, and with all due respect I say it, is not found in Sufism and Christian mysticism. In Christian mysticism you find a lot of information, in Sufism also, but not a system. And what I see the Kabbalah as being original, and that is why I say this is the mystical reserve of the West, is because what the sages of Israel have created over the last 20 centuries is a scheme at such a level of depth, with such a level of expansion and depth of the human soul and of the knowledge of the universe, that it really gives a very great answer to the needs of modern man. So what is happening today? That given the ideological dryness in which we have been left, because at the end the ideologies of the 20th century were strictly materialistic and this did not give an answer, then comes the Kabbalah with an approach of, I don't discriminate you from the material world, which seems to me important at an instrumental level, but I can offer you a number of methods and methodological systems, because they depart from the rational logic that in some way satisfy the intellectual demands of Western man. And this, I think, is really very important, what is happening today. What is happening today is that Christian, Muslim, atheist, Jewish students are finding in Kabbalah answers at a level that we cannot usually find in other types of philosophies.
Excellent, Mario. In the next chapter, we will continue talking about the history of the Kabbalah, the Kabbalists of the Sepharad and the medieval Kabbalists, and the current Kabbalists as well. Thank you, Mario.
Thank you, Nacho.